Hi, everybody. My name is Ujwal. I'm the co-founder and CEO of MotiveBase. I just wanted to do a quick setup in terms of what you're about to see with this research. So, Terry introduced this as the ethnographic database. In essence, what we're doing here is using artificial intelligence and big data to perform an ethnographic analysis of consumer culture. In essence, we're using technology to do observational research to decode the subtext behind what people talk about. And I say the subtext because what people talk about is the obvious stuff. What we're really interested in is the why behind it, and the things that don't overtly always get communicated, but are communicated nonetheless in the form of symbols and ideas that people just communicate through the natural ways in which they give meaning to topics, issues, ideas, and trends. In this particular case, we're looking at the culture of cooking. We've looked at a year's worth of data, and Derek, when you start, you can skip through the methodology slides, but maybe actually just pop over to the slide with the metrics or the stats. To give you a sense of the scale of the analysis that comes into play here, we have gotten data here, and this is any typical analysis that you get as part of this member benefit through CFI. You're going to get data here. It's the next slide, Derek, with the stats. Yeah, there we go. So this data comes from more than 400,000 unique individuals in the United States. We have studied the culture of cooking, which includes more than 12,000 topics, meanings associated with it. Basically, what that means is there are more than 12,000 things people associate with the notion of cooking, and we're exploring all of that here. And in order to do this analysis, Derek, who's one of our senior anthropologists, PhD, spent 30 hours leveraging the technology to deliver this output. The technology itself allows us to follow the breadcrumbs left by the consumer to understand the meanings. So Derek's job is not to assume anything, but rather follow the breadcrumbs, identify the themes, and group them and build a report, and of course, present it to you. So with that said, I wanted to do a quick introduction and hand it over to Derek to take you through the outcomes.
Great, thank you. So we're going to begin by discussing the motivational DNA of the consumers who discuss cooking online. So this is the motivations, attitudes, and fears that sort of drive these consumers to discuss the topic. So we found that the consumers who are discussing cooking online are people who really see cooking as the key to maintaining a happy family. So their primary motivation for entering this conversation in this culture is to prove that they're a good partner and provider by providing good, wholesome food to their families. They also strongly believe that good food keeps their family happy and healthy without sacrificing taste or comfort. So this is a mix of cooking healthy foods, but also the idea that home cooking is itself healthy. So a home-cooked pie, we'll see, for example, is still something that keeps the family happy and healthy. Finally, their driving fear is being an incompetent provider, because that in turn will mean they never receive the love and support that they need in their own lives. So we'll see these. Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt, Derek. I just wanted to add one piece there, which is the fascinating thing about, and the reason why we introduced the motivational DNA first, is that in every culture, there's always a mentality that people share that drives that culture forward. When we talk about cooking, obviously not everybody cooks. And clearly there is a mentality that drives the culture of cooking. So there's a certain type of people, group of people that really see cooking as intrinsically part of their lives. And this motivational DNA helps us understand what pressures, what's the why behind the what, and what are those pressures that are pushing this culture forward. And then the other thing that's interesting here is there's always a push and a pull with every culture, right? There's a positive aspect, the positive motivation, as Derek talked about, wanting to be a good provider. And then there's a negative aspect, which is how do I overcome my fear Or what is the fear I'm trying to solve for by cooking more or by cooking? And that's this notion of incompetence or feeling incompetent as a provider. And so that's the critical piece. And I just wanted to add a little bit of context. Every, it's a succinct deck, but it means every single slide has a lot to it. And I want to make sure that, we just cover these as we go along. So I'll add a little bit of commentary as Derek, you keep going here.
Sounds good. And we'll see that these motivational aspects are woven throughout every one of the demand spaces we'll be looking at. So it really informs the consumer. So the key demographics of the people entering this conversation that we saw are middle and upper middle class couples with children. And before we get to the demand spaces, I'm just going to introduce the Zone of Innovation framework. So through a bunch of marking tests, we've found that the best time to launch a solution into the market or meet a consumer demand is when it falls between 33 and 55% on the maturity curve, meaning 33 to 55% of the potential consumers have adopted the culture or have entered the conversation. That is, it falls in sort of the second half of what is known as the early majority stage of adoption. If it's before the zone, that means it just hasn't quite entered the mainstream yet, and it's a little too early to launch a solution. And if it's after the zone, by the time you can really have the runway to mobilize a solution, it might already be deeply entrenched. So we highly recommend focusing on opportunities that are expected to fall within the zone between 33 and 55%. And as you'll see, in terms of the demand spaces we found in this conversation, that's literally all 7. So that's an unusual, that's not always the case, but all 7 of the major demand spaces or themes we found were all within this 33 to 55%. Because demand space 6 and 7, which are whole fresh foods and boosting ready-made meals that you buy, are the most immature of the 7 that we'll be discussing. Those are the ones that have the most space for innovation over the next 1 to 2 years, because those are the ones that have the most runway time before it's going to be really entered the mainstream already.
So this framework, by the way, is central to everything we do. Obviously, hundreds of clients use this as a way to prioritize decision-making, whether it's on the CSR side, on the communication side, on the innovation side. And so everything begins with this framework, and then we'll now dive into each one of these demand spaces one by one and explain to you how the consumer thinks about this and what it means to them.
Yeah, so we'll see, we'll go into each one in depth momentarily, but we're going to be discussing cooking more international dishes, focusing on lean protein portions, increasing the veggies in the diet and making veggie forward dishes. This is not necessarily becoming vegetarian, but it's adding more vegetables to your diet. And that will be made clear between a couple demand spaces. Baking more at home, making really decadent meals as treats for special occasions. And then the last 2, which are the most immature, are whole fresh foods, this idea of foods that are real or whole, and improving ready-made meals like frozen dinners. So first, in international dishes, consumers are exploring their various culinary options from home. So right now, consumers want to explore more international cuisines by cooking Middle Eastern, Indian, and especially Asian dishes at home. Asian dishes with a focus on Chinese dishes especially are a major growing area. They see generally world cuisines as healthier and often cheaper than Western cuisines. And they like to test new ingredients or new flavors by adding them to dishes they're already very comfortable with. So for example, by using Korean barbecue sauces on making otherwise traditional Western style barbecue. And since January, there has been a growing emphasis on healthy ingredients and less interest in making high sugar Asian dishes like orange chicken. And what I mean by that is if we limit the data to before January, some of the major topics of conversation were things like orange chicken or General Tso's chicken, these Chinese American dishes with quite a high sugar content. But post-January, we find instead the topics driving change, which you can see in the bottom portion of the slide are things like steamed veggies, sweet potatoes, chicken breast, and plain rice, these ingredients that are generally associated with more healthy options.
Hey, Derek, could you take a minute or two and just explain the dashboard on the right-hand side of the screen so people have a sense of what they're seeing?
Yeah, I was actually just going to do that, Charlie.
Oh.
So you're going to see that on every slide here, folks. You'll see two things. The most important part is that adoption curve and that little egg-shaped visual. The adoption curve goes back to the zone of innovation that Derek introduced earlier. What our technology is doing is for every single demand space that we identify, so every demand space is identified by following the breadcrumbs that the consumer leaves for us. Once we identify the demand space, we then double click into it, and then the machine helps us understand two things. How many people is this particular culture relevant to? And it tells us a max number. So for example, here it shows 76 million people. That doesn't mean 76 million people are all the time caring about international dishes. It means it includes the core audience as well as the extended audience, right? So it's a max of 76 million people. That's the ceiling on this culture, but it's also telling us that this culture is growing. So this is a growing interest to the consumer. It also tells us where it sits in its maturity. It's about 40.5%, which means this is a culture that is quite well understood and it's continuing to grow, which means more and more people are understanding the value of this. And then what is it that they're understanding is what Derek just talked to you about. And I think the most interesting part here is this notion that somehow a world cuisine is healthier and more economical than a typical Western cuisine. I think these are the types of insights that are just so fascinating because it shows us how some of these perceptual frames get created and how they get propelled forward. And then the screenshot above it is an example of the topic universe. So there are all the meanings or all the topics that consumers associate with cooking, and then specifically here with international dishes. And some of the highlighted topics that you can take a look at later as well are just some key topics that we highlight that functioned as important breadcrumbs that allowed us to double click into them and learn more about how the consumer thinks about this demand space, what their mental model is, and so on.
And you'll see too in the top screenshot, there's also the section that says articles that's squared in red. And those are articles that these consumers are sharing with one another. So these are articles that are being shared among the consumers discussing this topic. What's really interesting is that this connection to Asian dishes, as you can see in Driving Change, is focusing on ingredients like sweet potatoes, chicken breast, steamed veggies, and plain rice, which aren't explicitly Asian. And what I mean by that is those are much broader cuisine items, but these consumers are really associating Asian style cooking with these healthy ingredients. So
it's like they're innovators without even realizing it, right?
Yes, yeah. So consumers see international cuisines as healthy, tasty, and a better value. They see them as cheaper to cook and make. And they're starting to build a strong link between ethnic cuisines and healthy ingredients like steamed veggies and sweet potatoes. So the second demand space we'll just look at is these lean protein portions. So these consumers are seeking lean proteins to reduce the added fats in their diet. And they're doing so in two ways. First, to reduce their intake of saturated animal fats, these consumers are cooking so-called healthier proteins, by which I mean proteins they associate with being healthier, or proteins they perceive as healthier, like chicken breast and salmon. They roast their proteins rather than pan fry or deep fry them, so they don't have to add as many extra oils into the process. And a big part of cooking at home is controlling the portion sizes and caloric intake that they're getting from these dishes. So, sorry? So since January, consumer interest in these lean protein sources has continued to grow more or less steadily in the same direction, although there's a little bit more of an emphasis now on vegetables to eat alongside the roasted meat, and we'll see as we go throughout the deck, that this desire to eat more vegetables on the side of meat dishes or other dishes is a major growing area. I didn't mention it in the previous demand space, but if you, as usual, was explaining, if you notice, these demand spaces are ordered in terms of the highest core market, so the highest number of people interested, to the lowest core market, although all of them are once more in the zone of innovation, so they're all in a point in their maturity in which they are growing and ripe for innovation. So these consumers are seeing fish, chicken, and legumes. Hummus comes up especially frequently in the form of hummus wraps or hummus dip as the protein source, and for example, a lunch, as leaner daily protein options to reduce their intake of saturated fat.
And Derek, when it gets to the reason that they're doing it, how did you come to the conclusion that it's tied to a desire to reduce saturated fat? Sure.
So if you see the top portion of the screen here, any of those highlighted topics like roast chicken, portion sizes, hummus, baked salmon, etc., we can click on those, and those tell us the leading connections, like the 10 other topics they associate within this universe to that core topic. So the 10 topics they associate with baked salmon most strongly, we can then add baked salmon and get a whole list of 200 more topics that are centered around home cooking and baked salmon. And then when we look at that topic cloud, we start to see more concerns about health and amounts of fat. So it's really by double clicking into the topics that were highlighted and sometimes clicking even further to really get a constellation of topics until we get a clear sense of what is driving the conversation that brings each of these topics up into the home cooking universe. Okay, so the third demand space that we're going to be looking at is veggie forward dishes. So these consumers are cooking more plant-based meals and side dishes, although as the previous demand space shows, they're not necessarily becoming vegetarian. Rather, they are adding some more vegetarian meals to their diet. So consumers do link plant-based diets to better health, and they are cooking more vegetarian dishes and more meatless meals, though they're not giving up meat entirely. They're adding vegan cheese replacements to homemade pizza or pasta dishes, or offering vegan cheese replacements, for example, vegan Parmesan replacements, if they're having pasta. Again, this helps reduce saturated fat intake, is one of the big motivators for those who aren't vegan for using these dishes. And consumers discuss broccoli, sweet potatoes, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, and carrots in particular as potent superfoods that they're trying to get more of in their diet. So these are the specific vegetables they're actually bringing up in these conversations. So since January, this demand space has seen a bit of a bigger change than the other ones, in that this conversation around vegetables being key to real food or being a big part of a real meal has grown quite substantially. So this language of real food, a real food diet, or making a real meal is really, really driving this universe right now, far more than it was prior to January.
Charlie, I think this is fascinating, given some of the conversations we've had at CFI now around, obviously the increased consumption of canned foods. It's so interesting now to see that, veggies synonymous with real food, as if the other isn't, right? It's just interesting how all of this starts to come together.
Yeah, and there's some pretty sensible motivating factors for that since January, like just how much more packaged food many people are just eating right now due to the quarantine.
Hey, Derek, this is David Fikes at FMI. Before you go back can you go back to this previous slide? Can you talk to me again about maturity curve? I came in right when you were starting to explain how that operated, but I want to make sure I understand it.
This is Ujwal. I can jump in. So the maturity is basically, if you think about the search here for, or the demand space of veggie forward dishes as your son. the meanings that people associate with the sun, let's imagine they're your planets in your solar system. What happens is, and I'm going to butcher physics here, by the way, in this analysis. What happens is that when a topic is really immature, this particular solar system moves in a haphazardly manner, as in the planets don't revolve in an even orbit, they're flopping around here and there, there's no consistency, and our machine can see that and calculate that and plot that. Now, when things start to mature, what happens is these planets start to stabilize. All these meanings start to stabilize. So the meanings are nothing but the 4 bullet points that Derek has provided here. So when something is more mature, especially as something enters into the early majority stage, it tells us that people now understand what this thing means to them in their lives. There's more consistency in the way or the nature in which people talk about this notion of veggie forward food. And the fact that it's growing further tells us that that consistency is going to continue over the next 24 months. So that's really what that's telling us. So it's really key, because there's some searches or some analyses where you might find it's actually volatile, and the system will tell us, actually, this is volatile. This solar system is all over the place. I cannot make a prediction. In fact, I can't even tell you where this sits in its maturity. So that also happens. So the benefit of this is really understanding whether something will hold water, has legs, and will carry forward in a consistent manner. And then the second metric you see is the number of people, the maximum number of people that are interested currently in this issue and will be interested in this topic in the future. So it's 72 million people is the max. So that includes obviously the core lead users as well as the followers and sort of the laggards in there. And then we can see it's growing by about 27%.
That helps. Thanks so much. And sorry if that's a repeat for everyone else.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's always good to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. So again, consumers are looking for recipes that foreground these superfood vegetables more than meat, although again, they're not cutting out meat in this universe. They're roasting, baking, and steaming their vegetables. We see more variety in terms of preparation methods when they're talking about vegetables. And they associate vegetables with overall health and vitality. So as the fourth demand space, we're going to look at comfort foods, specifically mostly baked goods, although this extends to things like pasta, especially homemade pasta. So consumers are making more comforting staples at home, such as bread, fresh pasta, dishes like that. They are adding whole wheat, buckwheat, and other alternative flours to their homemade items because they see this as more wholesome or adding to the health value. They discuss and they share articles that give you strategies for adding a little teff flour, for example, into your pie crust. And they're experimenting more at home with making things like sourdough because there is a strong growing interest in fermented foods that are being kind of pulled into this comfort food world. Since January, we see a similar trend as the last demand space, and in that consumers are discussing less restaurant quality bread or less about making restaurant quality pasta, and instead they're talking about making real food bread and real food pasta that uses simpler and fewer ingredients.
So Derek, you're telling me that the sourdough bread I made last night, even though it looked ugly, it would be deeply appreciated by these consumers?
It would indeed. We also have been making sourdough bread, and I do want to note too that this culture or this interest in bread, specifically making your own bread, of course, has grown faster than anticipated since the quarantine. But this was a growing trend pre that. So this is when we look back to January. This is something that was already showing good growth and showing maturity, but it's grown a little faster than anticipated given the last 3 months. So this is a really interesting vital finding, is that flours and fermentation and things like this, like using things like teff or a little bit of spelt, as well as fermentation, helps consumers feel better about indulging in foods that they may otherwise see as less healthy. So even if they're using the same amount of, let's say, sugar and butter and things like that, when they're making cookies or when they're making pie crust, these little changes, like adding a flour they understand is healthier, gives them an alibi to indulge in foods that may not otherwise fit a healthy eating mentality. So it helps them give them a little alibi, or helps them see that food as a little bit healthier than they otherwise would. So as the fifth space, we're going to look at these decadent treat meals. So consumers are far more interested in making elaborate meals when it's a special occasion. A specific meal that gets discussed quite a bit is steak frites, or just steak and fries that they cook at home. And they research how to best cook a steak to give it that restaurant quality sear, etc. And this is, again, where we really see that this universe isn't a universe that is becoming vegetarian, or this culture isn't one that's becoming vegetarian as a culture. It's increasing the vegetables in the diet, but they're still interested in getting a really nice steak. When they talk about these luxurious meals, they focus on quality. So they're looking for high quality meat. They're also looking for high quality cuts of meat. So they discuss not only the quality of the meat itself, but the quality of the cut, as well as nice sides that complement this good, fancy, elaborate, decadent meal arrangement, like fancy cheeses and rich sauces when they're talking about making pasta. This culture has been more or less stable. This demand space, has been more or less stable since January. It hasn't really changed much. There's a little more interest in the fancy meals you can make with the basic ingredients on hand in your pantry, but that's likely given the situation. I don't know if that would be a long-term forever change. There is slightly more discussion among these consumers as well about how to best make restaurant quality steaks, for example, at home. So when preparing a special meal, they're focusing on quality, expensive meat cuts. That's really the driving feature of these decadent meals, is quality cuts, quality meat, and they associate both quality cuts and quality meat with spending more money on the meat being more expensive. So now we're getting to the two spaces that have the most runway for innovation. These are the two most immature spaces, although they still fall within the zone. The first is whole fresh foods. These consumers prefer recipes that highlight fewer, higher quality ingredients. And by that, they mean they want simple ingredients that don't have any unnecessary additives or so-called weird ingredients, by which I just mean ingredients that appear on the packaging in their, for lack of a better word, more scientific name. So like your hydrolyzed yeast protein, things like that, these ingredients that they don't immediately recognize. They associate fewer ingredients with real food and a holistic approach to health. And when they're using fewer ingredients, they want to focus again on quality produce and quality proteins. So the quality, when they're talking about cooking more whole, fresh, real food, it's all about the quality of the individual ingredients themselves.
So Derek, this might be one of those situations where, working in the industry, I may be too close to the forest to see the trees, but this doesn't feel new to me. This doesn't seem new. So when you talk about this being something that has the greatest runway, that's a bit of a surprise to me. Is that simply because of where you're seeing it on the maturity curve, and does it have the largest predicted growth compared to the other demand spaces? Speak to me a little more about that, because this one to me seems like it's been a topic of conversation for quite some time. And again, that may be simply because I'm too steeped in the industry, and so I'm looking at it through the industry lens, not the consumer lens.
Charlie, I can jump in here. I think there are a couple of interesting factors here. You're right. The notion of whole and fresh has been around for a while. What's interesting is the specific interpretation of this. And this happens oftentimes, a very traditional term will get reset in culture because People just want to change what it means to them in their lives. And in this particular case, the part that's interesting is this notion of few ingredients. And I think that's the most interesting part about this, is this notion of simplicity and few. And that's what's causing a bit of a reset and causing growth. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the still a majority of even the products that are marketed as healthful still have labels that are, 5 lines long. And in fact, just yesterday we were on a call with leadership at a major food company that was talking to us about wanting to reduce one line item of one of their flagship products in terms of ingredients, and whether that will yield value for the consumer. So I think that's the part that's interesting here, is that it's almost nothing is new about the interest in whole and fresh. I think what's potentially pulled it back and then now pushing it further is this notion of few, and as few as a denotion of quality.
Great, thank you.
That's great. So again, as Ujjwal just highlighted, highlighting a few ingredients ensures that the quality of each ingredient shines through. So these consumers are really linking this idea of a whole or fresh food diet with few ingredients, with reducing the number of ingredients, and they organically are beginning to link a shorter ingredient list to real food. So again, it's not that real food is a new concept or whole or fresh food is a new concept, but rather this idea of a short ingredient list is becoming increasingly central to that concept. The seventh and final demand space is enhanced or enhancing ready-mades. So consumers want to make sure that their convenient food is a little healthier. This isn't necessarily about picking healthier, for example, TV dinners or frozen foods, but rather when they're cooking at home, they're adding to these items to make them healthier themselves. So when they eat a ready-made meal, such as a frozen pizza, for example, that came up a lot, they add frozen veggies or frozen lean proteins, such as canned tuna, to make it to feel like there's at least more real food in this instant option, or to feel like this instant option is a little healthier. Another common one that comes up is adding frozen shrimp to instant ramen packets. So these sort of things, adding frozen veg and frozen proteins to otherwise instant foods to quickly make them feel like they're more robust and healthy. They are increasingly seeing frozen options, including frozen dinners, as fresher and more healthy than canned soups or dried foods. So frozen is taking over this fresh space, and they are ordering meal kits like HelloFresh as a healthier option for convenient food than getting takeout or going for fast food, for example. Again, they just feel likely that the process of cooking it at home is healthier. So the fact that it's being cooked at home just gives these HelloFresh delivery meals a sense of being healthier or better for you.
I think this is my favorite demand space for two reasons. One is it's not technically cooking, but let's go with it because the consumer calls it cooking. And secondly, I love the fact that now the consumer, as a way to keep the convenience without losing or to create an alibi for seeking the convenience, now is looking to add value on their own to a ready-made option. And even the fact that HelloFresh also comes into play here is also interesting to me. That people are saying, okay, it's not enough to just rely on a convenient option. I'm going to add some health value to it and retain the convenience as part of it. And like the example of adding a good quality protein to a ramen noodle, just fascinating. Especially when you look at the nutritional profile of a ramen noodle you might buy. There's not much in there, but the moment you add value, you add nutrition to it, you enhance the ready-made. I think there's just something really interesting going on here. And the fact that it's also the most immature is also telling us that there's likely more innovation happening or going to happen too in this space that consumers care about.
Yeah,
and it might be interesting just to think about this as the convergence of pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, right? Where you get the focus on convenience as kind of the pre-pandemic mega trend, but now people are much more interested in health and immunity and. So this might be the convergence of those two things kind of coming together, where people are like, yeah, I don't really want to give up my convenience, but I am continuing to be more concerned about health. How can I bring those two together?
And I wouldn't underestimate the thrust on convenience, simply the magnitude of meals that people are having to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And by the way, sorry, Derek, I think I cut you off there, but and by the way, you know, even topics like restaurant takeout will also come up in this kind of universe, right? So even in those cases, people are adding value on their own, adding some health value to it. Which is amazing. And to Charlie's point, and I think, Derek, you probably were just going to say this, that last bullet point is also showing us the impact of the pandemic, right? Since January, this was a trend, but since January, we can see that there's acceleration, there's more interest here, and the topic universe has become more denser. So there's clearly, the fact that it's making a prediction shows there's long-term impact, but clearly it's been impacted by the last 3 months in particular.
Yeah, the big change over the last 3 months is in this frozen food space, for example, or in the packaged meal space. You are getting a lot of more topics about making it healthier. So a lot of more health-related topics are coming into these spaces. But when you click through and kind of follow through, it's definitely more about enhancing them yourself than anything, adding value to yourself more than anything else. Also, as Ujwal was saying, it's interesting even when you look at the takeout, if you kind of follow the takeout rabbit hole, you still get into conversations about people, looking to make healthy sides for their takeout. So like getting a burger or whatever from A&W, but then making their own sides at home, or like what are good, healthy, complementary sides. So it's really about enhancing these convenient foods to still make them feel like you are contributing positively to your health. So we've covered this, and that is the last demand space. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ujwal.
Yeah, I think that covers it. Actually, Derek, if you jump back to the zone of innovation slide, that covers the model. So we start with giving you a sense of the underlying motivations for cooking. We then break down the dominant demand spaces, all from the consumer-led lens. So what are the things that people care about in the context of cooking here? And then, of course, they get quantified and then visualized in this manner, and then, of course, detailed as Derek has walked you through. Any questions?
Yeah, can I put you on the spot a little bit? If you were a retail executive looking to expand your private brand portfolio, where would you go? Where would you put your money?
And I'm assuming you're saying private brand packaged food, shelf-stable packaged?
Yes, or I would, let's go there first, and then let's expand it to deli and ready-to-eats.
Right. So I think the last two are the most interesting ones here. So let's start with number 7. With number 7, enhancing ready-made meals. I think there's something really interesting about helping people enhance that. Part of this is a communication solve. Part of this could be in the form of kits. There are some companies that shall remain nameless, some of our clients that are experimenting with this already, kits that add nutritional value to a standard packaged meal or food that you can buy. So that's something really, really interesting. Another interesting place that I think is really important is this whole blending of well-known Western ingredients with international cuisine flavors. There's obviously some stuff going on here, but it's been the traditional narrative, right? Of, I'm going to have some sort of a Thai food sauce or pad Thai sauce or what have you. I think this is more about creating the fusion outcome through packaged food. So there's definitely an important opportunity there as well. So those are the areas where I would be thinking as an executive on the shelf stable side to have the greatest impact very, very quickly. And because these all sit in the zone of innovation, there's a time sensitivity to this. So this is a 12-month window. We can't wait 4 years for this. We're going to lose. And then on the fresh side, I would definitely focus on two important areas. One is simplicity of ingredients. So if somebody is buying from the deli, obviously if you take a typical retail, you'll get prepared foods that you might buy, like salads. You can also buy deli meats and cheeses and so on and so forth. Everything has an ingredient list to it. The more they can do to simplify that, the more impact they're going to have immediately. So there's some short-term things that they can do very, very quickly there. The other area that I would really look at here is this whole notion of saturated fat reduction that Derek talked about, the first two demand spaces. What could the retailer do in terms of quick changes to recipes to ease the consumer's concern around the saturated fat? Maybe it's through the introduction of some legumes to add some plant-based proteins, things like that. So it's really about if you marry, 6, 7, and then 1 and 2, you get all the really quick wins that they could bring forward.
Yeah, David, as I think about it, I mean, just in my own visual, I think about kind of the conventional grocery stores that I go to, and you've got the steam table full of highly processed Chinese food next to the pizza. And then you go to some of the higher end members that you would have, and it's an entirely different ready to eat kind of experience.
Yeah.
It's night and day.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, and particularly in light of some of our members, their experience during COVID is that their ready-to-eat department, which they thought would just take off and blossom, has not really done so.
Yeah.
But it may be part of what eventually comes out of this, whatever the new normal looks like. Yeah. Thanks. That was great.
Eric, this is Terry. Could you just back up a little bit on the slides and talk about the predominant demographic? I think you had outlined that early on about upper middle class, I believe. There we go. And couples with children. Could you talk a little bit about that vis-a-vis other demographics that you would have looked at?
So Terry, I can take this one. The way so obviously, this doesn't mean that the lower middle class isn't represented or that single people aren't represented. What this is really highlighting is where there's an over-indexing. So what that means is compared to national averages, these are two demographic characteristics that over-index when it comes to cooking. And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. Obviously, cooking is a class issue in the United States for sure. And so, it's a class issue. And then, of course, it's a life stage issue. Obviously, parents and their concerns about their children, plus, even the simple idea of having a partner to cook for or to help you cook. Sure. I mean, I think back to the fact that I didn't even know how to cook when I was single. It's a whole other conversation. So I think some of it is obvious, but obviously, there are many cases where we might do a report where it's not that obvious because there's something completely counterintuitive that's going on here. I would say it's not that counterintuitive. It's pretty straightforward in terms of the two key areas that over-indexes.
It also ladders back to what we saw in the motivations in regards to that notion of provision and providing, and really kind of goes back to that notion of the use of food to create a sense of stability, love, and confidence in the home. And again, I think that even kind of is coming through when we look at those demand spaces as well. It's the kind of the questions around, am I making the right choices? Not just for myself, but for my partner, for my children, for my family. Are the things that I'm basically bringing into the house satisfying the needs? And I think that the big thing that I see when I look at these demand spaces that are presenting themselves is that there's a an education that's taking place, right? It's this journey that people are going on where the needs that they have in regards to this notion of cooking is no longer just throwing stuff together the way that maybe my family used to do it. It's now I'm looking at, that kind of pasta sauce that my mom made, where it was just like a tin of stuff that went into it and a whole bunch of ingredients, and we just stirred it and it was all done, to now basically learning that, the best Italian sauce only has 3 ingredients, right? And it's all about the quality of those ingredients that actually elevates the taste, as opposed to lots and lots of stuff and lots of ingredients that are on that kind of label, on that kind of that tub of tomato sauce that I'm buying. So what this tells us is that, we have the opportunity to think about what are those inroads that we can make in regards to building the confidence of these consumers as they're going through that journey, right down to international dishes, right? How do we basically kind of help them feel like they're just taking that little tiny step outside their comfort zone? They're trying something new. They're getting their kids to try something new. They're becoming more worldly in regards to their relationship with food when it comes to the cooking journey that they have in their home, which not only tastes good and fills them up, but spiritually and emotionally makes them feel good, because they actually feel like that the act of cooking is not just providing substance, it's providing culture. And I think that that's a really, really kind of interesting area and an interesting thing that we're seeing kind of present itself. So it was really exciting to see not only what the system came back with, but for Derek and the team to kind of come back with these demand spaces. It was really, really ripe with a lot of opportunity.
Great, thank you. Other questions by the FMI team? I know it's a lot of content very rapidly, and we'll certainly share this report with you as well. But any?
This is Kelly. I have a question. So our research that we've been doing on tracking grocery shopper trends during COVID has kind of consistently come back with people being concerned about being able to get the food that they need or they want, and we've also had concerns about meat prices and things like that within the supply chain. It doesn't seem like your research saw any kind of concern of pricing or availability matched with people's cooking desires, but I was wondering if you saw anything around that.
Yeah, it's a great question. When we look at cooking, there are 2 important aspects here, right? So we're looking at the culture of cooking, and we're looking at what the dominant demand spaces are around the underlying question, which was, what are people cooking? And so our focus through the entire report was to understand what people care about when it comes to cooking. Now, if the question is, are people concerned about pricing? I'm sure, we could do a report on that and examine the issue of price. But what I can tell you is that the fact that it doesn't dominantly naturally come up means it's a short-term blip. And our technology is very, very good at ignoring the short-term blip and only take into account those changes that are here to stay. And that's a really important component of what the technology allows us to do, so that we can look ahead through the lens of culture and leave aside, some of the short-term factors that will change once, we're all operating with maybe just one hand behind our backs rather than 2. And I think that's really the likely explanation here. Now, of course, I'm sure conversations about pricing will matter, but the other thing you'll also notice is that this culture is led by the middle and the upper middle class who are cooking. They have families. You see the pricing conversation dominate in particular, and I know this through other research that we do, in particular with the middle and the lower middle class, and you also see a slightly different ethnicity makeup there too that we don't see here. So I think we're kind of looking at this through the long-term lens of what people care about through cooking, and what I would say is, because pricing isn't there, it's a short-term blip and not something that people are worried about when it comes to the things they care about around cooking.
Thank you.
I would only add that you do get a small sense of price advantage when they're talking about Asian dishes, for example. So in the conversation around Asian dishes, you get notes
Right.
about the price advantage of those dishes, but I wouldn't say it comes up in the sense of, in like a concerned sense necessarily. Rather, it's just one of the meanings associated with those dishes.
Right, Derek, that's a good point. Yeah, that's true, because they do talk about,
Added
you know,
benefit.
kind of smart decision making. Yeah, added benefit of cooking certain cuisines to get the nutrition at a lower price. You're right.
To piggyback on that, this may be the good follow-up to this as we live more deeply into the economic aspects of COVID-19, and as price, I think, is going to become more of a factor, even for the middle and the upper middle class. So it may be a good follow-up. Planting a seed there, Terry.
I hear you, David.
Absolutely.
Other questions for today from the FMI team? Of course, for your convenience, you'll get the report and a recording of the webinar. If you have more questions and want to connect back with the motive-based team, let me know and we can arrange that for you to look deeper into the data set. If you think that there are additional avenues that you want to jump into, as David mentioned, maybe around a pricing issue, we can certainly do that as well. So I can be happy to talk with you about that.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Your feedback too, in terms of what you liked or didn't like, or what went well or didn't go well. We are thrilled to have this partnership with MotiveBase and the insight that they bring. But we would just want to continue to maximize the value. So if there are other ways that we could add value through this tool to make the information more usable or helpful for you, please let us know, because we think it's a really exciting opportunity to partner with MotiveBase, and they bring some insight that we just don't see any other place.
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you so much.
Great point, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, with that, we'll end the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
All right, as well, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.